Welcome to the Useless Hour. Tonight we consider something that does not matter at all, and we are going to take our time about it. There is nothing here that you need to do. Nothing will be tested. Nothing in the next hour will be of the slightest use to you tomorrow morning, or the morning after that, or at any point in the remainder of your life. You may follow along closely if you like. You may follow along for 4 minutes and then stop and drift off somewhere in the middle of a sentence about Oklahoma, and that will be a perfectly successful outcome, arguably the intended one. The story will continue without you. It has been continuing without almost everybody for the better part of 90 years, and it is in no hurry now. Our subject tonight is the shopping trolley, the wire basket on 4 wheels that waits in a stack outside every supermarket in the world. The thing you put your hands on without looking, the way you put your hands on a door handle or the arm of a chair. It has a hard grey handle, usually. It has a lower shelf that you have used perhaps twice. It has one wheel that does not agree with the other 3, and you have accepted this about it in the way one accepts weather. Almost nobody has ever wondered where it came from. This is not a criticism. It is simply true of the whole category of objects that stand between us and the ordinary business of living. The trolley is not beautiful, and it is not interesting, and it does not ask anything of you, and so it has passed through the entire 20th century and a quarter of the 21st without being looked at properly by anyone, more or less ever. And yet it was invented. Somebody had to think of it. Somebody had to sit down in a particular room in a particular year and decide that this was a thing that ought to exist, and then spend a considerable portion of his life persuading a skeptical public to touch it. That man was called Sylvan Goldman, and he was a grocer. He was born on the 15th of November, 1898, in Ardmore, in what was then not yet Oklahoma at all. It was Indian territory, in the lands of the Chickasaw Nation, and it would not become a state for another 9 years. His father, Michael Goldman, had come from Latvia. His mother, Hortense, came from a family out of Alsace-Lorraine. They were merchants, which in a small territorial town at the turn of the century meant a dry goods store. And the young Sylvan worked in the one his father and his uncle kept, among the bolts of cloth and the tinned goods and the long, slow afternoons of a shop in a town where nothing much was happening. That is where the whole thing starts, if you want to be strict about it. Not with an inventor, with a boy behind a counter, learning, without ever deciding to learn it, the single subject he would think about for the rest of his life, which was how people move around a shop and what they pick up while they are doing it. He went to the war, as young men of that year did. He served in France, and by most accounts his work there involved the requisitioning of food, which is a small detail and easy to pass over, but it is the second time in his life that groceries had arranged themselves in front of him as a problem to be solved. When he came home, he and his older brother, Alfred, went into business together in Breckenridge, Texas, selling wholesale fruit and produce. The brothers would work together on and off for a great many years. Alfred is one of those figures who tends to get compressed out of the story, standing just off to the side of it, and we will try to leave him where he actually was, which is next to his brother, for most of it. At some point, the two of them spent time in California, and in California they saw something that did not yet exist in Oklahoma. It was a shop where the customer walked in and took the goods off the shelves herself and carried them to the front and paid. This sounds like nothing. It sounds like a description of a shop. But it was, at the time, a genuine novelty, because in the ordinary grocer of that era, you stood at a counter and told a man in an apron what you wanted, and he went and fetched it, item by item, and wrote it down. Self-service was new. Putting everything under one roof was newer still. The brothers went home to Oklahoma to try it there. Their first store opened in Tulsa on the 3rd of April, 1920, and they called the business the Sun Grocery Company. It grew quickly. The accounts differ a little on precisely how quickly, some saying 21 stores within a year, others saying it reached 55 within 3, and the truthful position is that it was somewhere in that region, and it was fast. In 1929, they sold the chain to Skaggs Safeway, which ought to have been the end of a very comfortable story. It was 1929, however, and a great deal of that money did not survive what happened next. There was also an agreement, as part of the sale, that kept the brothers from competing in Tulsa. So they went to Oklahoma City instead, and started again, more modestly, with a handful of stores under a new name. And then in 1934, at a bankruptcy sale, in a decade in which grocery chains in Oklahoma City were closing one after another, Sylvan Goldman bought a failing chain of shops called Humpty Dumpty. You do not need to hold on to the name Humpty Dumpty. None of this is required of you. It is simply the name that happened to be painted on the front of the building where the thing occurred. So picture the shop in the middle of the 1930s, in a city on the edge of the Dust Bowl in the depths of the Depression. The floor is wooden or tiled. The shelves run in aisles, which is itself still a fairly modern arrangement. There is a smell of sawdust and paraffin and coffee, and at the door there is a stack of baskets made of wicker or of wire, with a handle across the top, and every customer who comes in takes one and carries it on one arm for the whole of her visit. Think about that basket for a moment, because everything that follows comes out of it. Empty, it weighs very little. You could carry it all day. Then you put in a tin, then another tin, then a bag of flour, which is not heavy exactly, but which has an opinion about the matter. A dozen eggs, a bottle of milk in glass, because it is 1936 and milk comes in glass, and glass is heavier than what is inside it. Some potatoes, and now the handle has stopped being a handle and has become a thin bar of wicker or wire pressing into the crook of your elbow, and your basket is swinging slightly with each step, and your shoulder has begun to make its position known, and you are still only halfway down the second aisle. And there is a fair chance that you are also holding a child by the hand or carrying one, because the shoppers in these stores were overwhelmingly women, and the shopping was not a separate activity that happened when the children were elsewhere. It happened with the children present, attached and in motion. So you do the thing that any reasonable person does. You look at the shelf and you look at the basket and you decide that you have enough. Not because you have enough, because you cannot carry any more. Sylvan Goldman watched this happen. That is all it was. He stood in his own shop in the mid-1930s, and he watched his customers reach a point in their circuit of the aisles where the basket became too full or too heavy, and he watched them stop. They stopped choosing. They turned towards the front of the store, sometimes with items still on the shelves that they had wanted and would have bought, and they went and paid and they left. Some of them, the accounts suggest, simply left rather than carry it any further. It is not a dramatic observation. Nobody shouted. There was no moment of lightning.
There was a middle-aged grocer standing near the end of an aisle in Oklahoma City, noticing that the limit on his business was not price, and was not choice, and was not the depression, but was the strength of a human arm. And he began, slowly, to think about what could be done. The chair was in his office, which is where chairs generally are, and it had been there long enough that he had stopped seeing it. That is the ordinary fate of furniture. A thing that is always present becomes in time a kind of absence. The accounts place this evening somewhere in 1936, though they do not agree closely on the month, and Goldman himself told the story a number of times across a long life, in the manner of a man who has learned which details an audience enjoys. What survives in all the tellings is the object itself, a wooden folding chair of the sort that stood by the hundred in church halls and lodge rooms across Oklahoma, unremarkable in every particular, waiting patiently to be sat upon by nobody. He looked at it for some while, and what he saw, according to him, was not a chair at all, but a set of relationships between pieces of wood. There was a seat, which was a flat surface at a convenient height, and a basket would sit on a flat surface at a convenient height quite happily. There were 4 legs, which held the seat up, and which met the floor at 4 points, and a wheel is simply a way of making a point that touches the floor stop arguing with it. And there was the hinge, the pivot in the side rails that allowed the whole arrangement to swing shut and go flat against a wall, which meant that somebody, long before him, and for entirely unrelated reasons, had already solved the hardest part of the problem he did not yet know he had.
Because the difficulty with putting a basket on wheels in a grocery store is not the basket, and it is not the wheels. It is the other 364 days of the year in which the thing is not being used and must be somewhere. And a shop floor in 1936 was measured in square feet that were expected to earn their keep. A carriage that could not be put away was a carriage that would not be bought. The chair could be put away. The chair had been putting itself away for decades without anyone thanking it. Then he saw the second thing, which is the part of the idea that is genuinely his. If the seat could hold one basket, then the space beneath the seat, that shadowed rectangle between the 4 legs where nothing had ever lived, could hold another. 2 baskets, one above the other, on a single frame, moved by a single person. Twice the groceries and the same number of hands. For the building of it, he went to a man named Fred Young, a mechanic who worked for the company and who had, by every description, the particular temperament of the maintenance man. He could be handed an idea at an unreasonable hour, and would begin, without complaint, to find out whether it was true. Goldman had money and stores and a theory. Young had a workshop and the ability to make a joint that did not wander. The 2 of them worked at this in the evenings, out of sight, in the back of the operation, and there is something quietly pleasing in the thought of those hours. A grocer and a repairman in a back room in Oklahoma City, bending metal in pursuit of a slightly larger basket. The first attempt, if the usual account is to be believed, was made from an actual wooden chair, and it did what wooden chairs do when asked to carry a full load of tinned goods across uneven ground. It came apart. The legs of a folding chair are sized for the weight of a person sitting still, and a person sitting still is a very different proposition from 40 pounds of groceries being pushed over a threshold. So the wood was abandoned, and the frame was made again in metal, in tube, which does not splinter, and which can be bent into a continuous curve where wood must be joined, and where every join is a promise waiting to be broken. What they arrived at, and you do not need to hold any of this in your mind, was this: 2 rectangular frames of tubular metal
one at the front and one at the rear, each standing on its own pair of small wheels, each wheel able to swivel or not, depending on which version and which year you are looking at. Across the rear frame, at about the height of a person's hands, a handle. Between the frames, two horizontal shelves or cradles, the upper one at roughly the height of the seat of the chair that had started all this, the lower one near the floor. Into these cradles went the baskets, not fixed, not welded, set in the way a drawer sits in a chest, so that a shopper could lift a full basket out at the counter and set it down for the clerk, and so that the frame itself, unburdened, became a light and rather sad-looking skeleton of metal tube. And with the baskets gone, the pivot did its work. The rear frame swung forward towards the front frame, the shelves folded down between them, and the whole apparatus closed on itself and became flat, or very nearly flat, and could be stood against a wall in the company of 30 or 40 of its brothers, occupying, in the aggregate, less floor space than a single display of tinned peaches. He called it a folding basket carrier, not a cart, not a trolley. Nobody had said trolley yet, and it would have meant something else if they had. The company he formed to make them took its name from the same plain description, and the patent, when it came, used a phrase of even greater flatness: folding basket carriage for self-service stores. There is no poetry in it anywhere. It is the language of a man describing a fixture to a clerk in Washington. And it is worth noticing that the single most successful piece of retail furniture in human history entered the record with a name that could put a person to sleep, which, this evening, is not a criticism. On the patent, the dates are firmer than the story. The application was filed in the spring of 1938, on the 14th of March, and it was granted 2 years later, on the 9th of April 1940, as United States Patent 2,196,914. Sources vary on what was filed before that, and on how many separate applications Goldman made across those years, and on precisely how much of the design belonged to Fred Young, in any sense a court would recognize. Young does not appear on that document. Whether that troubled him is not recorded, and it would be inventing something to say that it did. It should be said honestly how little the object had going for it. It was not beautiful, it was not clever in any way that showed. It was grey metal tube and a pair of wire baskets, and it looked, to a great many people who saw it, like something borrowed from a hospital or a hotel corridor, and to others like something even less welcome, which is a matter for another evening. It rattled. It was cold to hold in January. And the storage problem, the whole reason the chair had been a revelation in the first place, was only half solved. The frames folded flat, yes, and stood obediently against their wall, but the baskets did not fold. They came out, and they had to go somewhere, and where they went was a separate rack, stacked one inside the next, in a different part of the store, which meant that every carrier, at the start of every day, had to be reassembled by hand, a frame drawn out and opened, 2 baskets fetched and dropped into their cradles, multiplied by the number of shoppers expected, performed by a person paid to perform it every morning before the doors were unlocked. It was, in other words, a solution that came with a small daily chore attached, which is the ordinary condition of nearly everything, and it was ready, and it was patented, and it stood in a row by the entrance of a grocery store in Oklahoma City, waiting for the public. The date most often given is the 4th of June, 1937, though it is worth saying plainly that the accounts do not entirely agree with one another, and that some place the first quiet trial a year earlier in a different one of Goldman's stores before the version that is usually called the debut. Goldman owned more than one grocery chain, and the carts moved between them in the early days, and the records that survive are mostly his own recollections given decades afterwards. So we will say June, and we will say 1937, and we will hold both of those loosely, the way you hold anything that has been handed down through 4 decades of retelling.
On the morning in question, the folding basket carriers were placed near the front of the store, not hidden away at the back, not tucked into a corner, but positioned where a person coming through the door could not reasonably fail to see them. By most accounts there were signs, printed and propped, explaining what the object was and what a person might do with it. By most accounts there were attendants, members of staff standing nearby, ready to answer questions and to demonstrate the mechanism, which was after all quite a pleasant mechanism to demonstrate. The frame opened, the baskets went on, the whole thing rolled. There was very little about it that required explanation, and yet explanation had been provided, because Goldman had thought carefully about this and had concluded that the only real obstacle was that nobody yet knew what the thing was. And then the store opened, and the customers came in, and they did not use them.
This is worth staying with, because the failure is not a small dramatic beat on the way to something better. It was, at the time, simply the outcome. Goldman recalled going into his largest store and finding not one person using a basket carrier. Not a slow start, not a modest uptake. Nobody. The shoppers walked past the carts, took up the small wire hand baskets they had always taken up, filled them until their arms began to complain, and went to the till. Some of them looked at the carts. Some of them, presumably, did not look at the carts at all, in the specific way that people decline to look at something they have already decided not to engage with. The attendants stood by, the signs remained legible. Goldman later described the whole thing, without any softening, as a complete flop. Consider the carriers themselves through the length of that day. Wooden frames, metal baskets, small casters, standing in a neat and hopeful row near the entrance of a grocery shop in Oklahoma City, catching the light, going nowhere. Every so often, perhaps one is moved slightly by an attendant tidying the line. Otherwise, they simply stand there, from opening until closing, being ignored by several hundred people in succession. None of this needs keeping, but it is, in its way, one of the purest images of commercial failure ever assembled. A solution to a real and universally experienced problem, offered free of charge, refused all day by the very people who had the problem. The question of why is the part that has kept this story alive, and it is the part that Goldman himself returned to most often in later years, because he had asked the shoppers directly, and they had told him. The men, he said, objected on grounds of strength. The reasoning ran something like this. A grown man in full possession of his arms does not require a wheeled apparatus in order to transport a modest quantity of tinned goods across a shop. To accept the cart was to concede something. It was to admit, in public, in front of neighbors, that the weight of one's own groceries had become a matter requiring assistance. Goldman's recollection of the objection has been repeated many times, and its flavor is consistent across the tellings. The men wanted to know whether he was suggesting that with their big, strong arms they could not manage to carry a small basket. Underneath it sat the older idea, never quite stated but plainly present, that the carrying of things is men's work, and the pushing of things is not, and that a man who pushes has stepped somewhere he ought not to have stepped. The women objected on entirely different grounds, and their objection was, if anything, the more immovable of the two. They had spent years pushing a wheeled conveyance around, and that conveyance had contained a child, and the pushing of it had been long and repetitive and largely unthanked. Whatever else the folding basket carrier resembled, it resembled that. The handle was at the same height, the posture was identical, the motion through a doorway was the same motion. And so a considerable number of women, having only recently arrived at a stage of life in which they were no longer obliged to push anything anywhere, looked at Goldman's invention and declined with a firmness that comes through even in second-hand accounts, on the grounds that they had pushed their last baby carriage and had no intention of taking up another. The older shoppers had a third objection, quieter than the other two, and harder to argue with. To be offered a wheeled support in a shop is, in a certain light, to be told something about how one appears. It suggested infirmity. It suggested that the staff had looked and made an assessment. Nobody wished to be the person for whom the cart had been provided.
Consider what Goldman was actually facing, stated plainly. 3 distinct populations refusing the same object for 3 incompatible reasons, none of which had anything whatsoever to do with the object. The engineering was not in question. The convenience was not in question. What stood between the shopping trolley and the world was an entirely social problem, which is to say, a problem about what other people would think, which is to say, a problem that no amount of improved casters could solve. Goldman's response to this is, by some distance, the most remarkable thing in the whole history of the shopping cart, and it deserves to be described slowly. He hired people to pretend to shop.
Not a demonstration in the ordinary sense, not a man in a uniform standing beside the display explaining the folding action, because that had already been tried and had already failed. What Goldman commissioned was a performance. He engaged models and actors, and he sent them into his own stores to move through the aisles, pushing loaded carts, looking entirely untroubled, taking items from shelves, considering prices, behaving in every respect like ordinary customers on an ordinary errand. The accounts vary somewhat on exactly who these people were. Several say both men and women, of a range of ages, chosen precisely so that no shopper could look at them and conclude that carts were for some other sort of person. Some accounts specify women of various ages. Some mention that his own staff were pressed into the same service. What every account agrees on is the essential shape of it: paid strangers circulating through a grocery shop, pushing empty and half-filled trolleys around for the benefit of an audience that did not know it was an audience.
And at the door, a greeter, a member of staff stationed at the entrance whose entire function was to take a cart and hand it to each arriving customer, and to show them how it worked before they had the opportunity to walk past it. This is a small addition, and it is a devastating one, because it moves the decision from something a shopper makes privately by simply not stopping to something a shopper must do actively in front of a smiling person who is holding out an object. Refusing became rude, accepting became easier than explaining. So the situation inside a Humpty Dumpty store in the summer of 1937 was as follows. A real customer would come through the door and be handed a trolley. She would look around the shop and see, in reassuring numbers, other people of about her own age and station pushing trolleys, entirely at ease, evidently finding nothing strange in it at all. And most of those people would be employees of Sylvan Goldman. Sit with that for a moment. A man, unable to persuade the public that a thing was normal, manufactured a population of contented users out of hired strangers, and let the real public look at it, and waited. He was not selling a cart.
He was staging a world in which the cart had already been accepted, in the belief that enough people saw that world, they would step into it.
They stepped into it. The performance ran for some weeks, and the resistance broke, and the ordinary shoppers began taking the trolleys of their own accord, and went on doing so, and are doing so still. Goldman, asked about it many years later by a television reporter who used the word shills, agreed without hesitation that shills was precisely the right word, and observed that immediately afterwards the thing became an enormous success. You do not need to remember any of this, but every trolley you have ever pushed is descended in a very direct way from a crowd of people who were paid to be there. The folding basket carrier worked, and that should be said clearly before anything else is said against it, because by the middle of the 1940s, the thing Sylvan Goldman had built was no longer an oddity that required paid actors to push it. It was ordinary. It was in stores across the country. It had done what it was designed to do, which was to let a person carry more than a person can carry. But a design can succeed entirely and still contain, quietly inside itself, the reason it will one day be replaced. And Goldman's design contained that reason in the very feature he had been proudest of. It folded. It did not nest. Consider what folding actually meant at the close of business in a shop with 60 of these things scattered across the floor. A member of staff would go out among them and take each one in turn. The 2 wire baskets would be lifted off, the upper one first and then the lower, and set aside. The frame, now bare, would be collapsed, the folding chair mechanism drawing the legs together, and the flattened frame would then be carried to a wall and leaned against it, or slotted into a rack, alongside the flattened frame that came before it. The baskets went somewhere else entirely. They were stacked, one inside the next, in a separate tower in a separate corner, because a basket is a basket, and a frame is a frame, and the two had no business occupying the same space when nobody was shopping. So a store ended each evening with 2 populations of objects where it had begun with 1. 2 things to store, 2 things to count, 2 things to keep track of and reassemble in the morning when the whole procedure ran backwards. A frame lifted from the wall, opened, locked into position, a basket set onto the lower rail, a second basket set onto the upper, 60 times, and a customer arriving mid-morning wanting a carriage could not simply take one, because a carriage in storage was not yet a carriage, it was components. There was also the matter of the wall itself. A folded frame is thin, but it is not nothing, and 60 thin things standing side by side add up to a length of wall that could otherwise have held merchandise. Every foot of a shop floor given over to storing the apparatus of shopping is a foot not selling anything. And grocers, then as now, were people who thought about floor space the way sailors think about weather. The man who solved this was named Orla Watson, and he was from Kansas City. He was born in 1896. He had left business college without finishing, and he had worked over the years as a stock clerk, as a machinist, as a draftsman, as a foreman. He had spent a working life in the company of mechanisms, and had acquired the particular kind of mind that looks at a moving part and asks what else it might be persuaded to do. In 1946, he founded a small concern called the Western Machine Company, and in that same year he applied for a patent on a shopping cart of an entirely different order. His idea was this: do not make the cart come apart, make the cart get out of the way of the cart behind it.
The mechanism, taken slowly, is almost restful. Take a single deep basket mounted permanently on a wheeled frame,
so that basket and frame are one object and always have been and never need to be joined. Now look at the back of that basket, the wall nearest the person pushing it. In Watson's design, that rear wall is not fixed. It is a gate, hinged along its top edge so that it hangs down like a flap and closes the basket by simply being heavy and being where it is. It swings only one way. Pushed from the outside, from behind, it lifts and swings up and forward into the interior of the basket, rising towards the horizontal and folding itself against the underside of the handle. Pushed from within, by tins and boxes and a bag of flour, it does not move at all. It rests against its stop and holds. Now take a second cart and push it into the back of the first. The nose of the second cart meets the hanging gate of the first and lifts it, and the gate obligingly swings up and out of the way, and the second cart slides forward into the body of the first until it can go no further, and the two of them stand there occupying rather less than twice the space of one. The baskets themselves are tapered, narrower at the front than at the back, so that each one enters the one ahead of it the way a paper cup enters a paper cup. Add a third, and the same thing happens again. Add 20, and you have a row. And the row is the entire point. 20 carts that would have needed a considerable stretch of wall now stand in a line, perhaps a quarter or a fifth as long, and none of them has been taken apart, and none of them needs to be put back together, and any one of them can be drawn off the front of the row by a single customer with a single hand and be immediately a working cart. Nothing is assembled, nothing is stored in two places. The evening ritual of 60 frames and 120 baskets collapses into the simple business of pushing carts into other carts until they are all in a line by the door. The labor saved is not glamorous, but it is real, and it repeats every single day of a shop's existence, and it is the sort of saving that persuades a grocer far more reliably than novelty ever did. Watson went into business on it. In 1947, he joined with a man named Fred Taylor and a salesman named George O'Donnell to form a company called Telescope Carts, and the carts appeared that year in a Kansas City grocery run by a man named Floyd Day, which is a very ordinary name for a shop to be the first of its kind. And then there was the fight. Sylvan Goldman was not a bystander in the shopping cart trade. He owned it. He had invented the field, he manufactured for it, and he collected royalties from it. And he had his own designs and his own claims, and when Watson's nesting cart appeared, Goldman filed a competing patent claim of his own and contested Watson's priority, which is the polite legal term for arguing about who thought of a thing first. Goldman also did the commercial thing, which was to produce nesting carts of his own and sell them at a price several dollars below Watson's, using the manufacturing weight of an established business against a new one. The accounts of exactly how this proceeded differ in their details, and where they differ, it is better to say so than to smooth it over. What is not in dispute is how it ended. In 1949, Goldman gave up his contesting claim, and on the 16th of August of that year, Orla Watson was granted patent number 2,479,530 for the telescoping shopping cart. You do not need to remember any of this. In return, Watson licensed the design to Goldman, so that Goldman could go on manufacturing and selling nesting carts, and Watson would receive a royalty on each one. The precise financial terms are reported inconsistently and are not worth inventing. The shape of the thing is clear enough. Watson was recognized as the inventor. Goldman was left with the right to make the invention and to make money from it. Which of the two was the outcome that paid? Watson lived until 1983. His name appears in the patent, and in the archives, and in the collection of a museum, and almost nowhere else. Goldman is the name attached to the shopping cart in the general memory, in the anniversary articles, in the anecdote about the hired actors. The cart in the supermarket car park tonight, and in every supermarket car park, has a hinged gate at its back that swings up when the cart behind it arrives, and it is Watson's cart, and it has been Watson's cart the whole time. There is an argument about the shopping cart that is made quietly, mostly by people who study the history of retail for a living, and it goes further than it first appears to. The argument is that the cart did not simply serve the supermarket. The argument is that the cart made the supermarket possible. To see why, it helps to think about what a shop was before the cart arrived, which is to say, what a shop had been for the whole of recorded commerce. A shop was a room sized to the human arm. Whatever else varied, the grain merchant's stall, and the village grocer, and the early self-service store all shared one hard limit, which was that a customer could leave with only as much as a person could hold. 2 hands, a basket over the elbow, a sack across the shoulder, a child pressed into service. That limit was not a matter of willingness or of money. A shopper might have wanted more, and might have been able to afford more, and might have had a perfectly good reason to buy more, and none of it mattered, because the goods had to be carried, and the arms tired quite quickly once the weight passed 20 pounds or so. That single physical fact reached upwards through the entire structure of the trade. Because a shopper could only carry a small amount, a single visit had to be small. Because a single visit was small, visits had to be frequent. Because visits had to be frequent, the shop had to be near, within walking distance, on the corner or on the high street, embedded in the neighborhood it fed. And because the shop had to be near, and near meant expensive land and a small catchment of customers, the shop had to be small. Everything followed from the arm. The arm set the size of the trip set the frequency set the distance, and the distance set the building. The cart removed the arm from this chain. It did not persuade anyone of anything. It simply took the weight, which had been the load-bearing constraint of the entire arrangement, and put it on 4 wheels and a steel frame, and once the weight was gone, the chain came apart, link by link, over about 20 years. What happened next is easier to see in the buildings than in the sales figures. A wheeled object of a fixed width had entered the shop, and the shop had to be redrawn around it. Aisles that had been sized for a person, or for 2 people edging past one another with a murmured apology, now had to admit a cart, and then inevitably 2 carts passing, because a shopper who cannot get past another shopper stops shopping, just as surely as a shopper whose arms are full. Modern store planning guidance still carries the fossil of this. A secondary aisle in a grocery store is generally laid out at somewhere between 4 and 5 feet of clear width, and a main run at 8 to 10, and the shelving units on either side are placed with those clearances in mind. Doorways widened. Entrances stopped being doors and became openings. The checkout, which had been a counter where a person set down an armful, lengthened into a lane with a belt sized to receive the contents of a cart in a single unloading. The trolley bay, the corral, the little metal channel at the front of the shop, all of it is downstream of a decision about width.
And then the shop simply grew.
A grocery store in the early 1930s was typically under 10,000 square feet, and the first King Cullen, often held up as the first true supermarket, was something in the region of 6,000. By the middle of the 1950s, the average American supermarket had roughly tripled to something around 18,000 square feet. Today, the figure is usually given as somewhere in the low 40s of thousands, having touched a peak nearer 49,000 in the middle 2000s before drifting back a little. That is a building 5 or 6 times the size of the one it replaced, filled with the same kind of goods, sold to the same kind of person, and the difference between them is very largely the difference between an arm and a wheel. You do not need to remember any of this. It is simply pleasant at this hour to know that the width of the aisle you last walked down was decided by a man in Oklahoma who wanted his customers to keep going for another minute or two. Once the trip could be large, a new idea became available, which is the weekly shop. Not the daily errand, not the pop-in for what is needed tonight, but the single large expedition, planned in advance, written on a list, undertaken once and then not again for days. This is now so ordinary in much of the world that it feels like a natural fact about food, and it is not. It is about 80 years old, and it required a chain of containers, every link of which had to be in place before it made any sense at all. The cart was the first container, taking the goods from the shelf to the till. The second was the boot of the motor car, taking them from the till to the house. This is why the supermarket and the car park arrive together and cannot really be separated. Once a shopper arrived by car, the store no longer had to be near and could be built on cheap land at the edge of town where there was room for a large building and a large area of tarmac in front of it, and the distance that had once limited the trip became the thing that made the trip worth making. The third container was the refrigerator in the kitchen, and this is the part that is most often left out, because a fortnight of food is only a sensible purchase if a fortnight of food will keep. In 1930, something like 8% of American households had a mechanical refrigerator. By 1940, that had risen to roughly half. By 1950, it was around 80%, and the home freezer and the frozen food aisle followed close behind. Shelf, cart, boot, refrigerator. 4 containers in a row, and the whole of the modern food economy sitting on top of them. There is one further piece, and it must be handled with some care, because it is the part of this story that has been repeated the most and verified the least. It is a settled belief within the retail trade that a larger cart produces a larger purchase, and that if you give a shopper more empty space, the shopper will feel a mild and unexamined obligation to fill some of it. The belief is genuinely held, it is taught, it is designed around, and it has visibly shaped the equipment. The carts have grown, and that part is not in dispute. A hand basket of the 1930s held something in the region of 1,200 cubic inches. A nesting cart of about 1950 held roughly 5,500. A cart in a warehouse club today, when somebody goes round with a tape measure and actually checks, comes in above 15,000. That is more than a doubling since the 1950s, on top of a more than quadrupling before that. What is far less certain is the number attached to the effect. You will very often see it said that doubling the size of the cart increases purchasing by 40%, stated flatly with the confidence of a measured constant. That figure appears to originate with a single marketing consultant describing his own commercial experiment, rather than with a published study that anybody can go and read, and it has since been copied from article to article until the copying itself began to look as evidence. Other percentages circulate too, and most of them trace back to nothing in particular. It is worth adding, gently, that the wider field of supermarket and eating psychology has had a difficult decade, with a number of its most quoted findings withdrawn. So the honest position is this: the trade believes it. The carts have grown enormously. The precise arithmetic of why is not something anyone should recite with confidence. Which leaves us with the plainer and better documented fact, which is quite large enough on its own. An object was designed to solve one small problem in one small chain of grocery stores in Oklahoma City. That problem being that people stopped buying when their arms got tired. It solved it, and in solving it, it set the width of the aisles, the length of the checkout, the size of the car park, the distance from the house, and eventually the dimensions of the buildings in which most of the world now buys its food.
The child seat came 10 years after the cart itself. Sylvan Goldman added a place for a child in 1947, which was, as it happened, very good timing, since a great many children were arriving all at once. Before that, a child who came to the shop with a parent generally rode in the lower basket, down among the tins and the paper bags, an arrangement that was so ordinary at the time that a magazine cover of the era depicted it without comment, as simply a picture of a Tuesday. What Goldman added was a small folding panel set into the back of the basket, near the handle, with 2 openings cut into it for a child's legs. Some 5 years later came the refinement that made the thing genuinely elegant, which was to hinge it. A hinged panel is a seat when a child is sitting in it, and a shelf when no child is, and it moves between those 2 conditions by falling forward under its own weight when nobody is looking. There is no switch, no catch, no instruction. The object changes its purpose by leaning over. Very few pieces of everyday industrial design do 2 entirely different jobs with one flat rectangle of wire, and hardly anyone has ever noticed this one doing it.
The seat faces backwards. This is worth sitting with. A child placed in a shopping trolley is not looking where the trolley is going. The child is looking at the person pushing it, and past that person, at the aisle slowly receding, at the shelves arriving over one shoulder and leaving over the other, at the ceiling lights passing in a slow and regular series. For an enormous number of people, somewhere in the region of most of the industrialized world, this is among the earliest experiences of the world at all. Not walking through it, not being carried through it, but being wheeled through it backwards at the height of an adult's chest, with the entire visible universe drifting away from you at the speed of a parent choosing between 2 kinds of soup. The one thing that does not move in all of it is the face above the handle. Everything else is going quietly away, and that face stays exactly where it is. A seat that carries a small child a good distance above a hard floor is of course a serious piece of equipment, and it is treated as one. There are published safety standards covering how these seats and their restraints should be built and how they should behave, written for children from around 6 months of age up to about 4 years. Restraint straps became a standard fitting through the 1990s, pushed hard by the largest retailers, and the small printed instruction on the panel asking you to use the strap is there for the ordinary and unremarkable reason that seats several feet up are safer with a strap than without one. That is all it amounts to. Use the strap, and we can move on. Because the cart has another habit, and it is the great subject of the second half of this hour, and it is this: The cart leaves. Not in any dramatic sense. It simply, steadily, and by the thousand goes away. A trolley is not a cheap object. A single ordinary one costs a retailer a meaningful sum, comfortably into the region where a shop notices several, and the reinforced ones, the ones with child seats and heavy casters and electronics, cost considerably more than that. A supermarket buys them in the hundreds, and then, over the following years, some proportion of them wander off into the world and do not come back. Figures for how many are lost circulate very freely, and most of those figures cannot be traced back to anything solid, so it is more honest to describe the shape of the problem than to put a number on it. The shape is this. It is continuous. It is universal. Every large retailer plans for it as a running cost, and in a number of towns and cities it has become large enough to be dealt with in local bylaws, with fines and impound yards and formal notices about abandoned trolleys, which is not the sort of municipal apparatus that grows up around a small problem. They go home with the shopping, which is the most sympathetic case, and are left in stairwells and on landings and beside bin stores. They are abandoned at the far end of car parks, where they roll gently downhill into cars. They end up in hedges, on verges, at bus stops, in ditches, in canals and rivers, where they are pulled out periodically by volunteers and by the people whose job it is to keep waterways clear, standing in the shallows with a rope, hauling up a wire basket full of silt. And so, over several decades, an entire quiet field of defensive engineering grew up around the problem of keeping a trolley on the premises. The first and most widespread solution is the coin deposit lock, which anyone who has shopped in Europe knows in their hands before they know it in their head. A short chain runs from each trolley to its neighbor. Inserting a coin or a small plastic token cut to the same size releases the chain and frees the trolley. The coin stays inside the lock for the entire duration of the shop, held hostage. It is returned only when the trolley is pushed back into the rank and the chain from the next trolley is pushed back into the slot. Patents for coin-operated trolley locks go back to at least the early 1980s, and the system spread widely from the 1990s onward, when trolley losses were bad enough that retailers wanted something. What is remarkable about it is the modesty of the sum involved. The trolley, which is worth a great deal, is guarded by a coin worth almost nothing. It is not a deterrent in any economic sense. It is a very small bribe offered to you by the shop on the condition that you tidy up after yourself, and it works because human beings will walk a surprisingly long way across a wet car park to retrieve something that is theirs. The second solution is the corral, which is simply a fenced rectangle of railings placed out among the parked cars, a destination nearer than the shop door. It is not a lock or a mechanism of any kind. It is an argument about distance, made in steel. The third is the boundary system, and this is the one to fall asleep to. A single wire is buried in the ground around the perimeter of the car park, following the edge of the property. It carries a low-frequency signal in the region of 8 kHz, at a frequency chosen because it will travel a short distance up through tarmac and no further. One wheel of each trolley is not really a wheel. Inside it there is a small coil, a small circuit, and a small motor connected to a brake. The wheel spends its entire working life listening to the ground. For years it hears nothing. It rolls up and down aisles, over thresholds, across painted lines, through puddles, and it does nothing at all, because none of that concerns it. And then, one afternoon, somebody pushes the trolley over the buried wire at the edge of the car park, and the coil hears the signal it has been waiting years to hear, and the brake closes, and the wheel stops turning. It does not lock the other wheels. It does not sound an alarm or announce anything or object. The trolley simply becomes very difficult to push in a straight line, and then impossible. And it stands there in the open with 3 wheels that are perfectly willing and 1 that is not.
You do not need to remember any of this, but it is worth noticing that the wheel has no idea what a car park is. It does not know what a supermarket is, or a trolley, or theft, or property, or the concept of a boundary. It has been given exactly one rule in the form of a frequency, and it has agreed to enforce that rule for the rest of its life, without supervision, without complaint, and without ever once being praised for it. Somewhere near you tonight, in the dark, in the rain, there are several hundred of these wheels lying quietly in nested rows, listening to a line in the ground that nobody has crossed for hours. And then, for everything that gets past all of that, there is the last line of defense, which is not a mechanism, but a trade. There are firms whose entire business is the retrieval of other people's shopping trolleys. They run flatbed lorries fitted with racks, and they drive fixed routes through housing estates and industrial parks and the edges of towns, looking in the places where trolleys are known to accumulate. They have contracts with retailers and in some places with local authorities as well. They carry keys to release the locked wheels. Many of them wash and repair what they collect before returning it, straightening bent frames, replacing casters, so that the trolley arrives back at the shop it left in slightly better condition than it wandered off in.
It is a whole small industry, with vehicles and staff, and routes and invoices, and it exists entirely because a wire basket on casters, once given wheels, turns out to be very good at going places. He was, by then, a rich man, not from groceries in the end, or not chiefly from them. The stores had made him comfortable, and the chain he built in Oklahoma City had made him locally important. But it was the carts themselves that made him wealthy in the way that outlives a person. He set up a company to manufacture them, the Folding Carriers Company, and he did not simply sell the machines outright and walk away. He supplied them, he rented them, he licensed the design, and he collected on the folding carriers that spread out across the country into the stores of other men, men who were not his customers and often his competitors, and who nonetheless found that they now needed several hundred wheeled baskets each and knew of only one place to get them. Accounts from the years after the war describe a waiting list running to more than 2 years. He is generally described as having become a multi-millionaire. The precise figures vary between sources, and I would rather not give you a number I cannot stand behind. So let us simply say that the thing he had invented in order to get people to buy more tinned goods had become a manufacturing concern with a national reach, and that the money came in steadily from everywhere on wheels.
He did not stay in the grocery trade. The chain was folded into other things and eventually sold on, and Goldman moved his attention to the ordinary machinery of American wealth: real estate, office buildings, hotels, shopping centers, which is a pleasing sort of circle if you care to notice it, banking, insurance, savings and loan institutions, scattered, according to the Oklahoma Historical Society, from Hawaii to Puerto Rico. He is also credited with turning his mind, late on, to the wheeled luggage carriers found in airports, which suggests a man who had discovered exactly one very good idea and could not stop turning it over. He stayed in Oklahoma City. That is the part that tends to surprise people when they think about it at all. He had the sort of money that permits a person to live anywhere, and he lived where he had always lived, in the city where the first heavy baskets had been set down on the shop floor. He gave a great deal of it away there. He gave time and money to the Southwest Center for Human Relations at the University of Oklahoma. He paid for the portico and the western entry of Temple B'nai Israel in 1981. In January of 1983, the Oklahoma Blood Institute moved into a new building on North Lincoln Boulevard called the Sylvan Goldman Center, towards which he had given $1.5 million. There is a park in the southwest of the city that carries his name, and there was an honorary doctorate from Oklahoma City University, and he was inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame in 1971, and he was given a Humanities Award in his honor some years before that. These are the small, respectable monuments of a long civic life. Not one of them mentions the wheels.
He was married to Margaret for 53 years. She died in November of 1984. He died at his home in Oklahoma City about a week after she did, at the age of 86. The sources are not entirely agreed on the exact day. Some give the 25th of November, some give the 26th. It is a very small discrepancy, and it has never been worth anybody's trouble to settle it, and it will not be settled tonight. The following year, his family commissioned a sculptor from Oklahoma, Lena Beth Frazier, to make a bronze memorial for him. It is a shopping cart. Not the original folding carrier, but the later nesting kind, the one that came from the dispute, the one that everybody actually uses. It has bronze groceries sitting inside it, a carton, a box of eggs, a bunch of celery, a packet of cereal, all of them cast in metal and going nowhere. It stands at the Science Museum in Oklahoma City. A man spent a lifetime in commerce and philanthropy and real estate across 2 oceans, and what his family chose to leave behind, in bronze, was a trolley with the shopping still in it. And that, more or less, is the whole of it. There are, at a very rough estimate, tens of millions of these machines in the world tonight. Nobody counts them properly. They are among the most frequently touched objects on the entire planet, handled more often than most tools, most instruments, most vehicles, and almost nobody has ever looked at one. Not properly, not once. You have pushed one thousands of times, and you could not draw it from memory. You do not know how many wheels swivel and how many do not. You do not know how the child seat folds, or which way the flap hinges, or where the little plastic sleeve for the coin sits, or how the basket tapers so that one may slide into the next. You have never noticed the taper, and the taper is the entire invention. Somewhere tonight in the dark, they are standing in rows. Under the tall lights of a car park, in the fine mist that gathers on painted steel after midnight, nested one into another in long silver lines, 100 baskets folded through 100 other baskets, each one resting inside the one before it, perfectly still. The wheels are not turning, the flaps are down. The lights buzz very faintly above them, and the tarmac is wet, and there is nobody at all. In the next town, the same. In the next county, the same. Across a whole continent, and across the sea, and across the one after that, rows and rows and rows of them, in bays and shelters and corrals, all pointed the same way, all folded into one another, all waiting for a morning that is still some hours off. They are not doing anything. That is the loveliest part.
Millions of small machines, invented in 1936 by a man who mostly wanted people to buy more tins, and refined by another man who wanted them to stack, and defended by lawyers, and chained and coined, and fitted with wheels that lock at the edge of a car park. And right now, at this hour, every single one of them is simply standing there in the dark, quite still, doing nothing whatsoever. You do not need to do anything either. None of this was ever needed. Not the patent numbers, not the hired actors walking the aisles, not the dispute over the telescoping frame, not the coin locks or the retrieval trucks, and certainly not the dates, which you have already begun to lose, and which is exactly as it should be. There is nothing here to carry forward, nothing to remember in the morning. No part of this will be asked of you. So let it go. Let the shop go quiet. Let the lights in the car park go soft and orange and far away. Let the long silver rows sit there without you, nested, patient, going nowhere at all until someone else arrives. You may put it all down now. Sleep well, and when you next find yourself wanting to forget, just for an hour, everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting. Good night.